11 seasons, she both befriended and annoyed the Bundy family as Marcy Darcy on Married with Children. This time out, the brilliant AmandaBearse and I chatted up about the wild early days of the show on Fox, stepping behind the cameras to direct, and her hand-picked episode, The Worst Noel. I'm Jerry Strauss, and this is The Laugh Track.
Do you need your weekly comedy fix? Relax while we visit the sitcoms you love, the jokes you remember, the characters you will never forget, and the stars that bring them to you. Sit back. It's The Laugh Track with Jerry Strauss.
Amanda, thank you so much for being here, for being a part of this episode. I'm so excited to have you, not only because Married with Children is, in my opinion, one of the greatest and most influential sitcoms of all time, but I think you are probably the very best person to talk to about it, because not only were you there from beginning to end, but you were such a driving force behind the cameras as well.
Well, I was the only cast member who made that choice to direct, so yeah, it gave me an additional perspective.
Yeah, definitely. And I we're going to get into that, especially as it relates to the episode on tap for today. But before we get there, why don't we just dive a little bit into your journey that led you to this show? Because I think so many people identify you so closely with this show as if it's your entire career and your entire life. And of course not. You had a before, a during, and so many things that you've done afterwards. But what got you to this point as far as your journey in your career?
Well, you mean to the point of Married with Children?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. So, I often ask myself that question when we were on set, because it was such a wild and crazy ride at times. And as we know, it was an inappropriate show at the time in the 80s or 90s. It certainly wouldn't be made now. And there were some of those moments where I was like, I'm not sure what's going on and why. But I've always loved to laugh, although I didn't really think about pursuing comedy specifically. I grew up doing theater, and I'll cut to the chase there. After majoring in colleges, I ended up at the neighborhood playhouse to study method acting under Sandy Meisner. And that was a successful training ground for me. And then I also made a choice that I wanted to have a career on camera and to pursue that rather than work in regional theater or New York theater. And fortunately, that was offered to me sooner than later. And I started my career in New York on a soap. And I had never been on a soundstage before. And it was fascinating, both as an actor involved in the work, but also just to watch what it was going on set. Because when you grow up doing theater has a much more collaborative sense, I think, with those on stage and those backstage, much more so in some ways than film and television does. But I'd always had that consciousness when I was on a set. And I think that's what led me into my second career eventually. So I was on the soap for a couple of years, and I had a strong storyline for a little while, and I was tired of living in New York and freezing and crying at the bus stop. And although people still would take the subway, well, it's colder there too. But so I wanted to try things out in LA, which was the Mecca back in the day. This was the mid 80s, and there was very much a traditional 3-network plus CBS formula for broadcast television, and that formula also for pilot season, so new programming that was cast in usually January, February, March. So I left for LA in January, and then come the end of March, I didn't really have anything going, although I had been able to get representation in LA, which was a big accomplishment, but no real jobs to say. And they called me from the soap and said, okay, we've got a storyline, come on back. And I was young enough and brave enough or dumb enough to quit a paying job and
Wow.
And just stay where I was, because, and I love soaps, and the soap I was on My Children was the only one I'd ever watched. So to be able to end up in Pine Valley, and it was at a pretty much of a heyday at the time of that show, because I mean, Elizabeth Taylor, Carol Burnett were both guest stars during the run. Kathy Bates had a storyline when I was there. I mean, and this was early on in her career. So it was a great time to be on it, but you can live and die on soaps. And no problem with that. It just wasn't what I wanted. So I hung out in LA. I liked the sunshine and the flora and fauna anyway. And it took a little while, but I ended up booking 2 films back to back later in that first year I was there. And one of which has also becomes a cult classic. So it's funny that the 2 things I'm most known for as an actor ended up being these sort of cult following projects, and that was a horror film called Fright Night. Right. So then I had a bit of a lull. I looked younger than I was, which served me well. I mean, I was 23 playing a high schooler on the soap opera, and then I was 26 playing 17 in Fright Night. And it reached a point where you didn't buy me as a teenager anymore, and I really didn't look like a 30-ish yuppie. And those were the 2 sort of main categories for casting at the time. The 20-somethings that Friends ushered in, right? That Gen X, right? Is that what that's the letter?
I think so.
Yeah, I'm a bottom of a baby boomer. So there weren't roles for people in their 20s. It just really wasn't happening. So I just didn't work for a while. And needless to say, it was pretty discouraging. I mean, I did an episode of something here and there, but it just wasn't time. And then I got the script for this sitcom for this network that they were launching called FBC. And they said there would never be a 4th network. Now, by this time, a couple of years down the road, Ted Turner's, mega mogul empire had started with CNN and Turner Television, and then MTV was on the air. So the cable industry was just starting to break, and FBC, when they were trying to be classy, like NBC, CBS, whatever, became Fox. And the first night of programming, prime time, was the slate of shows, one of which was Married with Children. So it's interesting because I actually had never been offered to read a pilot script before. So it was a whole new formula. I grew up on television. I was a television kid. Are you getting static?
Yeah, I think we're breaking up a little bit. I'm not sure.
Well, it's weathery where I am. Where are you?
I'm in New Jersey, actually.
Weathery too. So, okay, now it's kind of clear, but we can just take these pauses when
yeah,
it's to get bad like that. So anyway, I was offered to read the pilot and to read for the pilot, and not really having a frame of reference, I thought it was funny, but I didn't. It was sort of like, well, what's this network and what is this show? But I approached it as I would any other script or character, and came at it with what kind of choices, who do I see this person as, and where do I find myself in her, and where do I find her in me? And initially I actually based her on my mom. My mother was this sweet, genteel Southern woman, very gracious, and all hell could be breaking loose around her and she'd still have a smile on her face. and just, you know, everything was fine and just try to maintain. And so that pilot episode really was Steve and Marcy just entering into hell with the next door neighbors and trying to figure out what it was exactly they were in. And
Right.
but Marcy just kind of kept smiling through, you know, being brought up the way she was. But that was episode number 1, and then cut to, oh Lord, over 250 episodes later, things got a little crazy. So
Yeah, things evolved over time, but you know, for those out there who, for whatever reason, maybe missed that era, that period of time, they're just too young and just never have come in contact with this this monster of a show called Married with Children. Let's just give them the quick synopsis of exactly what this show is, because it really did fall in line with a lot of the offerings that I remember Fox bringing to the table in their very early days, which is shows that were kind of irreverent and just totally different than what you would see on the standard networks, almost to the point where it seems like that's exactly what their initiative was, just to bring things that you would never see anywhere else. And Married with Children was kind of a family sitcom, but thrown like almost thrown in reverse, almost like a bizarro world where everything that you know about what a family sitcom should be, it was a different feel and a different situation, because instead of this family that could kind of overcome everything because they were the upstanding people that you looked up to, they were almost the people that you kind of laughed with and pitied because their lives, and I'm talking about the Bundy family, were just so kind of down on their luck and just so much more relatable in a way, but in a comedically negative way. Is that a good way to describe the Bundys?
Sure, absolutely. I can give you a little bit more backstory if you'd like, and I think you gave the early executives at Fox, the president at the time was Barry Diller, a lot of credit for thinking this was the type of show they wanted to put the stamp of the network on. That's not actually true. We were not his favorite show. He wanted this sort of classy network. One of the original sitcoms was with George C. Scott. And then there was another half hour with Patty Duke, and neither one of those did very well. And it was just this little bastard show at 9 o'clock that the audience hung on to. And it became the signature that gave Fox that stamp of irreverence. And then The Simpsons on that original night of programming were a bumper in and out of commercial on the Tracy Ullman Show. And Tracy is just a marvelously talented woman, and her comedy was both subtle and broad, really. I mean, she could sort of reach all corners with her characters. And then this little comic strip that came in and out of commercials was sort of fascinating too. And it didn't take very long for that to get its own order and become The Simpsons. And then there were just different sitcoms that were put in and around Married with Children that came and went. And I think there was one that they just kept trying to reincarnate with Alison LaPlaca. It was a wonderful actor, but they just kept trying to make it work because she was so good. And, you know, a situation comedy is just that. It's the situation. It's usually set in a home base. This was old school multi-camera television, and which they're now doing live, which is so crazy. But this was very formulaic. And so the formula was there, but the original title that Michael Moy, one of the creators, said was working title was Not the Cosbys, which of course we have to put in context because the Cosbys at that time were the all-American family of parental guidance and love and working out, you know, a little morality play every week. Of course, we know what happened to him, rightly so, but it was the anti-Cosby.
And we should also, just out of context, we should also mention that for a lot of its run, The Cosby Show was the #1 show on TV.
Oh, for years and years and years and years. And then NBC also had a great success with Family Ties with Michael J. Fox, which again took that formula of centered on a family. But it was a do-gooder show. And then along comes this little mean-spirited sort of loser central character of a show, and that's where the audience found the network. So, and there's stories, of course, that go with that. One of the other things that I didn't know for a long, long time, but found out, Michael and Ron Levitt, the other creator, were fans of the Roadrunner cartoon. So I know that dates me, but for those who watch Nick at Night or whatever Cartoon Network now, that it was that Wile E. Coyote always trying to outsmart the Roadrunner and never winning. And I think having Al Bundy be sort of the male mortal version of Wile E. Coyote, and the silliness and the antics, and Wiley wasn't a really likable character on the cartoon, and you wanted to see him try to get his way, and then you also loved it when he didn't. And I think that became part of the formula for the character of Al Bundy, that he wasn't every man and every kind of common guy, but you could point and laugh at him. And hopefully it just made you feel a little bit better just to get a laugh. Sometimes made people feel better that, okay, my life doesn't suck as bad as his.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then, with Steve and Marcy, and then Jefferson and Marcy, and then, of course, just all the characters blossomed into their own uniquely, I don't know, out there selves. They all really became we became the Simpsons in terms of going so far out into cartoon land with some of our storylines.
Well, it's interesting because thinking about it today, and you mentioned you and Steve, that was your first husband on the show, and then it transformed into Steve being out and Jefferson being in, as far as the characters go. But it feels to me like I was thinking of almost the idea that yourself and Steve in the beginning would have been the main characters were this to be a standard Family Ties type show, just a standard family sitcom. But this was kind of the story of the neighbors of those people from their perspective, and kind of painting them as sort of the lovable losers, and maybe looking at the dark side of that do-gooder family. And that's kind of, to me, what Steve and Marcy represented, at least in the beginning.
Well, I think you're right. And I think, we tried to rise above it, but more often than not, we went down with the ship, and, just sort of fell to that level. But again, it was all in good fun. There was absolutely no socially redeeming value to the show. I mean, and it is, some of the episodes are horrific in terms of the objectifying women, and just the meanness of the show, which was of the era, which is why it's coming back to haunt a lot of us in this day and age, because the behavior now is considered really abhorrent. And a lot of people, including myself, found some of it really distasteful. But I didn't write the show. I was not hired to critique the show. I was hired to bring the character to life. And then I was given the opportunity to create the pictures and the performances to some degree, and structure the show as a director. But the show was what it was, and it took off. And at the time, men watched sports and news predominantly, but not a lot of entertainment television. And Married with Children became a show that they enjoyed. I mean, that's why a lot of our advertising was geared, beer, Budweiser and Miller, and we got those kinds of advertisers because guys were watching the show.
And I certainly, even though being a kid, I certainly loved it myself. But it's funny, and we're going to get into the episode in a minute, but I just want to touch on what you said about just kind of the mean-spiritedness of the show, and you kind of forget exactly how un-PC the show was when you compare it to today's standards. But I watched the episode we're about to talk about today on a video service, YouTube or something like that. Earlier today, I watched it again, actually. And I did it while I was sitting partially in my car. Then I took off to drive somewhere, and I didn't realize the video was still playing. So it shifted to a different video, which was like a 10-minute compilation of Al Bundy's insults, basically all towards customers in his shoe store. He was a shoe salesman.
Yeah.
And so I spent about 10 minutes just listening to fat joke after fat joke and just horrible insult after horrible insult. And of course, hilarious in the context of the show. But I was just kind of in disbelief because I don't think any of this would fly today in any part of TV.
No, and that's also why it didn't fly to ABC, CBS, or NBC. Now, I don't know the specifics or the details of how the show became developed, or if it was ever shopped elsewhere, or if it was developed for FBC. But this was the last show that was produced under the Embassy Television emblem, which is Norman Lear's company. And, we could look at it as a bookend to All in the Family, like I said, which is going on live these days, which is I watched one and I thought, okay. But I think we could just hang on to new programming. Anyway, but whatever, it's kitschy. But All in the Family and then Married with Children, they have kind of a bookend formula and look. It's kind of raw, it's not pretty, it's shot sort of flat, the lighting is not kind, it's just kind of an in-your-face style of show, and edgy. All in the Family, though, and again, some of what you hear them say, and that's, I think, why they're putting them back up on the air, is so jarring. But he's being called out on it. No one on Married with Children was called out on the things that were being said. I would give it back to Al, and Marcy and Al's exchanges, I think, were great fun because we were the most polarized characters in the show. And people have said to me over the years how much they enjoyed watching that banter, because it is, conflict makes good comedy. But even just to say that it's not PC is mild, really, when you go back and look at some of what was going on. And yet it was of its time and it struck a chord, and you know what? It's never left the air, which is also quite remarkable. So here we are in this day and age of where people are at least trying to walk a better line, a lot of people, in terms of how they speak to one another. But, people are still finding this show. You're absolutely right that now we've reached an area of the youngest generation that is not watching it, that does not know it. We went through, over these 30 plus years, a generation or two. But this younger group, that's growing up in a more PC world, they're not watching it. Their parents, their aunts and uncles, their grandparents did. But again, we were just trying to go to work every day and make people laugh. And, yes, it was at other people's expense, including mine. Nobody was safe. And that was our job. And, that's not a bad job.
Let me just ask you before we dive into this, because you talked before about your theatrical background and now heading into this situation, which was, as you said, old school, traditional, multi-camera studio audience comedy. Did you look at this as a form of theater as far as your approach and being able to kind of get the appropriate rise out of the audience to engage that live audience? How important were they to that process of performing every week?
Well, it's a great question. And they were absolutely a character in the show. And you can see with these, as the show went on and the characters became known, and, you know, Al Bundy would walk through the front door and we'd just have to wait for a minute or so till the audience died down, because they'd cheer every time somebody came in to the room. And then you also, with comedy, it's all about timing. And you have to ride that wave. So you're exactly right. It was like doing a play in front of a live studio audience twice on production night. And then it got broadcast to millions of viewers. So it was the best of all possible worlds. But our audience was especially alive. We're especially engaged. And we all said it was like having another character in the show.
And it wasn't just the Al Bundy thing, you know, as time went on. And this episode was certainly a situation where it was all of you. Whenever anybody walked onto the stage, onto the in front of the cameras, the crowd just went crazy that first time they saw all of you, because you'd all, at this point, and we're talking about season 8, episode 13 in a moment, you were all iconic characters. And I think that, you know, that's really a testament to all of you and the writing and the evolution of the show itself, that they just love to see you guys week after week. That's the marking of a legendary sitcom.
Well, those are really kind words. And I do think it begins and ends on the written page. And I think an audience gets a lot of comfort in knowing what's coming, you know, not knowing, but knowing. So that when each character comes into play, okay, what's this going to be? And there's an anticipation, but also a familiarity that you look forward to. And you're right, by this time we were in season 8, so we were a known commodity, all of us. And it was lovely to experience. Unfortunately, it took time away from the body of the show, and we had to deliver the show at, 22 minutes every week. And we'd have to hold, and it was very difficult to kind of cut in and out of some of that reaction. We'd have to forsake other things in order to fit the time frame. But there are worse things than having we never had a laugh track, that's for sure.
It's amazing. And you can tell certainly just sort of that organic love that audience had for all of you guys. And it's at this point at a fever peak pitch here for this episode that you selected. And like I said, I'm so glad you did. And the reason why I particularly love this episode, which I don't have a real deep memory of from seeing years ago, but I'm so glad that we revisited it this time. It's one of those episodes where nobody goes anywhere. It's essentially taking place entirely in the living room, and then some scenes with what Bud and Kelly Bundy are doing are outside the house, but nobody leaves the Bundy property for this one. So it's a very encapsulated episode.
Yeah, they're just outside the back door, and it's the simplicity of this episode. I think it's really well written, but I love the simplicity of it. And this episode in particular plays more like a play because it is just on one stage. And when you have multi-camera television, you're in a proscenium like you are in a theater. And you have that framework. And then you watch the actors, the characters come in and out. And even though Kelly and Bud are in the background and outside the patio doors, it's still that home base set. And one of the reasons why I chose this, we are known for our irreverent Christmas episodes. Some of them were really legendary, when Santa Claus falls to his death, the mall Santa Claus. coming out,
Yes.
making a stunt that didn't go well. And that was our very first one. So that launched us. And then, of course, the Sam Kinison two-parter, It's a Bundy for Life. But
Sure.
this one is special to me also because I directed it, and I remember so clearly the making of it and how much fun it was in the actual moment, because it played like a play. There was one commercial break, but there weren't scene breaks. So it was like a play in 2 acts.
Yeah.
So it had a lot of flow to it that you normally are broken up by having to stop, move the cameras, change the set, go to another set, blah, blah, blah. That was not the case here. But what that called for was a continuity of pace. Now, back in the day, directors like myself were in a sound booth, a video audio booth that sat above the audience. So there was this, you'd have to run behind the audience and go up this, like, quite a flight of metal stairs to get into the audio booth, and then for me to sit in the director's chair in front of the wall of screens. So I have a Polaroid of me in the final costume that I'm in that lights up Merry Christmas on my ass.
Right.
And there's a Polaroid of me in this silver wig, and it's just taken from the back. So it's me sitting in the director's chair in front of the wall of screens with that lit up on my head. But I would have to literally run and time it so that, because I wanted to stay in the booth and be snapping the timing of the shots as long as I could, but I had to make my entrance because I didn't, you didn't want to hold up the flow of the show. So the making of that one was particularly, how can I say it? It was an adrenaline rush. It was really quite fun.
I'm sure. And let's finish giving the framework to this one. So again, this is season 8, episode 13. It's called The Worst Noel. And this is just another in a long line of classic Christmas episodes that Married with Children delivered. And if we want to give just a little overview, a synopsis of it, it's actually a pretty simple story here. We've got essentially 3 things going on. We've got it's Christmas Eve. We've got Al and Peg Bundy, who are doing what appears to be a pretty traditional thing for them on Christmas Eve, which is sit on the couch and fight over what they're going to watch on TV. While this is going on, Kelly and Bud, they have found, they seem to insinuate that they found off the back of a truck an old school jukebox that they're going to plan to gift their parents for Christmas. But meanwhile, they're having this wacky plot outside, unbeknownst to Al and Peg, of trying to get the thing in the house. So they're struggling with that. And then meanwhile, yourself, of course, Marcy Darcy and husband Jefferson are in the midst of throwing a holiday party next door, unbeknownst to Al and Peg, who clearly have not been invited or told about this party. So you guys just keep popping over to borrow things for this party that they are not invited to. So I mean, that's pretty much the episode, right? Have I missed anything?
It is. It's pretty much that simple. Now, Peggy does get invited because there's a very funny reveal.
Right.
That Al goes to the bathroom, he comes back, and then you see Peggy has a party hat on. And of course, Marcy and Jefferson are lying through their teeth and coming over to borrow things from the party, and Al's just bemoaning the fact that he had such a good time at the one the year before, and of course he did horrible things, which is why he wasn't invited back. And then by the end, when Marcy comes in a little loopy, and that's when she's got the Santa suit, the Santa dress, whatever on, the Santa helper dress. She's pretty well lit, which she's also known to do at those Christmas parties, because one of them, she Xeroxed her ass. Remember that one at the bank? But
yes.
Anyway, we're at this one, and it's so simple, but yet, to me, it's laugh out loud funny, because of the timing, the lines that are funny themselves, but also the timing of the physical comedy with the Bud dummies flying up in the air and falling down and things falling on him. It's very Roadrunner cartoon. It's very Wile E. Coyote.
I was happy you said that before earlier in this conversation, because that's exactly the note that I took down when watching the episode, is that there's almost this entirely verbal play going on in the living room while there's almost a cartoon going on right outside the house. Two totally different styles of comedy that you're jumping back and forth between, and that feels like that's got to be a huge credit to the director of the episode. So that's a big credit to you.
Thank you. Again, I am, if it's not on the page, no matter how many bells and whistles and pretty pictures you make, it won't improve it. But I had a lot of fun, and we got to shoot some different angles because we never looked up at a bedroom window from the patio. We never really spent much time on that back patio, but I also liked it in terms of the depth of field. We had Alan Pegg in the foreground, and you could see what was going on in the background. And that's what I mean by depth of field. So you had both things happening, even when you were focused on what was in the foreground. And then you had this cross action, this entering and exiting with Marcy and Jefferson. So it really was a flow. It was a flow, but it was, I swear, those dummies and the way they landed, and it just never fails to make me laugh.
It was great on all fronts. And, one of the things from the very beginning of this episode that struck me and reminded me about why I think Married with Children had such a big appeal was when Al is first going through channels and realizing that It's a Wonderful Life is on just about every single channel that he's clicking to, and just this critical feedback from him about just how much he hates this movie. And that's something that you just don't really hear. And I think, like, personally, I can relate to the fact that, I'm not as in love with Christmas songs and with Christmas movies like I feel like you're supposed to be. Like most people at least try to, try to perpetrate sort of that idea that everything Christmas must be holier than thou and must be cherished. And Al represented that opposite opinion of, this movie kind of sucks. And I think that's a big part of the appeal of Al Bundy and the show. They said things that others would not say or you wouldn't hear anywhere else.
But you might be thinking. The other thing I think that's so strong about this show is that each character is very defined in it. That it's the simplicity of, it's just the dynamic between husband and wife with Alan Pegg, and his reacting to and his antics and his carrying on, and her neutrality, and again the Bud and Kelly dynamic, and it's just, there's such a beauty in the way that they are interacting with each other. And then you've got these side characters, which is what the neighbors were, these fifth and sixth bananas that blow in and out, and again add a joke or two, or create a storyline that becomes a continuing storyline for the episode. But it was, to me, a very clearly defined character episode as well.
Definitely. And I think it was really interesting to see Alan Pegg just kind of interact in this way the entire episode. There's no wacky scheme going on. There's no super, exaggerated situation that makes the whole episode feel like a Looney Tunes cartoon per se. In
Right.
their corner of the world, they're really just not that far off from what a lot of other married people may do or how they may interact when they're in a situation where they're fighting for the remote control. They're just hanging out together, but they're still together.
And that's
And
the strong writing. And it is, you do understand though why they're together. And that dynamic, and there is affection in that dynamic. And the same thing with Bud and Kelly. And the same thing with them flying in and up and down the stairs. And who was that? I don't know. Well, I don't know. And it's just like, oh, there's children. And again, there is a real, I think, ease and identification with the storyline that makes it pretty special. So I'm glad you liked it.
I love the fact that, Kelly would pass and say Merry Christmas. Who is that? I don't know. Bud would pass and say Merry Christmas. I don't know. But later in the episode, Kelly walks by and says Happy Birthday. Who is that? Oh, that was Kelly. Like, what? She got it wrong. That identified her. But another big part of this that I thought was really interesting, and this just took up a lot of the conversation between Al and Peg while flipping through channels, is essentially it was almost like an outlet for satirizing or just making fun of different other TV shows or aspects of pop culture, which is something that you normally might see, a parody or something that's visual, something that's, a piece of content that's more devoted to that joke. But here it was all just done through verbiage, just through them looking at TV.
And his physicality, because Ed, and I told him this so many times, he would have been a great silent film actor because his physicality as that character, he didn't need words. Of course, he had good words to say. And you're right, there was social commentary going on in terms of what channels they landed on, and then how they both reacted to this similarly, and then they had opposite reactions and things like that. But Ed is just so funny to watch, and he's just writhing the whole time.
And it was, I even took notes just to go through some of these things that they hit on, some of which, again, are jokes and topics and targets that just would not hit today or would not even be approached today. They made fun of PBS. They made fun of I Love Lucy, with Al going as far as to say that it should have been, Mr. Merckx.
And he called Ricky an illegal alien.
Yes, he did, and he basically said
a Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Sandra Day O'Connor joke. I mean, I know.
Michael Bolton, kind of an easy target, but there was a joke about BET showing their special Malcolm Xmas, which I don't think would fly today. They went hard at NBC, basically saying they're irrelevant to television at that point. Fat jokes about Sally Struthers during the days
he
when
went
she was
on about that a while. Yes.
The Home Shopping Network, A&E, country music, and just really portraying that as pretty brutal and repetitive.
And it was a great button too, with what happens with the jukebox. They come in with the record. Oh my gosh, are we going to have this sweet moment and this sort of classic little family picture where they're all huddled together? And then no, not exactly, because then it doesn't quite work the way you thought it was going to. And I felt like it was almost a perfectly written episode in that way.
Yeah, that was the grand finale. It was after Bud and Kelly completely failed in their attempt to bring this jukebox into the house and broke the whole thing. They managed to salvage what they thought was one Nat King Cole Sings Christmas Classics record, and they go to play it and finally enjoy it as a family. And like you said, no can do, the record's broken. So they get about 5 seconds of it in. And, that's as Bundy as you can get.
Yeah, exactly.
let's. Oh, something else I wanted to mention, because you had talked about how All in the Family was sort of almost a precursor to this show. One thing that really struck me, and I noticed all over again watching this episode, is Al kind of doing those mannerisms of, putting the imaginary gun to his head and just, put me out of my misery, that type of silent motion. As you said, silent acting. That's very reminiscent of something that Archie Bunker had done on a bunch of classic episodes, where he would pretend to, like, uh, wrap a rope around his neck like a noose sort of thing, and do like a pantomiming of hanging himself.
Exactly. Well, this Embassy was Norman Lear's company. Now, Norman had sold the company by the time Married with Children had come along, but we actually had a lot of crew that came up and worked for years and years and years through the Embassy television banner. Not long after the show was created, Embassy was sold to Columbia Pictures Television, which was then sold to Sony. And so we became produced ultimately by Sony for the Fox network. But there was definitely a signature look to a lot of those Embassy shows, All in the Family, The Jeffersons, Silver Spoons, Laverne and Shirley, It's Your Move. I mean, these kinds of shows that just fit that mold. So it's really kind of sweet that Married with Children, we were given the opportunity to make television history by launching the fourth network, where they said there would never be one, but also, and anchoring it for 10 years, but also being that bookend to such a tremendous influence of television for decades, because Norman Lear, and that's why they're reinvigorating it here in 2019 and 2020. They've just picked up more to do episodes of The Jeffersons and All in the Family. It's interesting because television is a young industry, in that when you think about it, it really kind of came into being in the middle of the last century. And for those of us who've been in the industry, I've been in for 35 years, I've been in television for about half the life of television itself. And so to be a part of it, first as an audience member, but then to also experience the evolution of the medium. And now it's just to infinity and beyond, because television is where some of the best work that's being generated, period, is happening. There used to be such a segregation between television and film, but not so anymore. So, it was a pretty remarkable experience, not only to be a part of a show that made such an impact socially, but also, or not socially, but you know what I mean, impact in terms of audience favor, but also to have its mark in that spectrum of the history of television.
Would you agree in saying that Married with Children was almost conceived to be sort of the anti-sitcom that over time, through quality and through just the evolution of the show and the way it ingratiated itself into the hearts of viewers, do you think it went from being an anti-sitcom to one of the great sitcoms, which undoubtedly it is? But I mean, does that sound like an accurate sort of description of?
Well, if you're using the phrase anti-sitcom in the way that dramatically, when you have the anti-hero, it's sort of like what comes to mind is the films in the 1960s, like Dustin Hoffman in The Graduate. He was the protagonist, but you didn't root for him necessarily. He's that anti-hero guy. And so if you use it in that framework, I think it is an anti-sitcom because of the lead character of Al Bundy. It was, though, very formulaic. And I think that's part of the comfort of it, is that Norman Lear stamp, that multi-camera, old school live audience broadcast way of production, that was very much traditional sitcom. You know, Seinfeld came along and really broke that mold in terms of going from a few scenes and an act break and a few scenes to 20 scenes in one show.
Right.
And from that moment on, the formula shifted. And there's still only a few shows on the air that still ascribe to that sort of old school live in front of a studio audience, multi-camera formula. So in many ways, it's not anti-sitcom. It's very much to the heart of old school sitcom. However, Al Bundy is an anti-sitcom hero, or a sitcom anti-hero. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and an iconic one at that, as are yourself and everybody who was a part of that show from beginning to end. I would say, definitely living on in history. Like you said, the show has never left the air, so you're still gaining new viewers all the time. But for anybody who, for whatever reason, is learning about this show through this show, then first of all, mazel tov to you. Second of all, I would say that even though it's very late in the game, we're talking about an episode in season 8, I think this is a great jumping on point just to sample what this show is all about in its purest form. The Worst Noel, season 8, episode 13. I think this is a great place to start if you want to sample Married with Children. Do you agree?
Well, that's why I chose it. So there you have it. And, I go to these conventions now, which is a whole universe in and of itself, to talk about my work as an actor, which ended with Married with Children. I went behind the camera on that show. They gave me my second career, and that's where I've been for, almost 30 years now. But it's interesting to have this conversation with you at this point in time, because I'm re-entering the acting world.
You are?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
And yeah.
Go. So okay. So what is that going to entail? What's the plan?
Well, I don't know yet. You know what? It's not out. It's not entirely up to me. But I started, and it's also been a full circle experience. I directed a play in New York a couple of seasons ago, and I ended up on stage in it. And that was the first time I had done any work like that in decades. And I fell in love with it again. Hollywood's it's a brutal industry. And when I wanted to gain momentum with my career as a director, I basically had to choose, okay, am I an actor or a director? Because Hollywood at that time, and there weren't many women behind the camera in television, and of course not in film, and I chose directing. And so I shut that acting door. I was ready to put it down. And then just rode the momentum of my career as a director. But I am at a stage in my life where I have a lot of options open in terms of freedom. I've grown my child. She's a young adult and a marvelous human being. And I have an opportunity to just kind of look at my life and go, okay, what now? And it's starting to happen where I'm doing a little bit more in theater, which is sort of where I cut my teeth way back when. It's sort of a nice full circle experience, but I'm also making the commitment to spend more time. I haven't lived in Southern California in this millennium. I left LA in 2000 to grow my daughter elsewhere and to live elsewhere and continue to work part-time on the West Coast as well as in New York. But now I'm willing to sort of go back into that part of the country and see what might happen. So it's nice to talk to you about this part of my life that who knows if there will be a resurgence, but I'm just enjoying the opportunity to walk back in.
I have to ask you, because I can't believe this wouldn't be at least a conversation at some point. Has there been any talk that has reached you about bringing this show back in any form?
Well, what I've heard, that's the best I can offer you in terms of reach. they were talking with David Faustino, and there were announcements in the press. This is some years back when they first were coming up with these reboot ideas. And of course it lends itself, married with grandchildren or remarried with children, because David Faustino is Al's age now. He's actually a little bit older than Ed was when we started the show.
That's insane.
And it would have been wonderful, but apparently there is some complexity involved with the one of our creators has passed away, and just some legal complexity, which what was my understanding is what put a pin in it. That's not to say that it couldn't happen. I don't have any idea, but it was mostly centered around Bud. And I just thought that would have been wonderful for him.
Do you, as someone who is looking at sort of a wide open future now in your career, and so many different options I'm sure will be coming your way, would you have a certain passion or a certain preference for, if not that project coming to fruition, something else in the vein of those few but still existing traditional multi-camera sitcom situations? Is that a place you would want to go back to?
Well, I just like to work, and I appreciate your confidence in me. And, but like I said, it's not up to me, but I'm just kind of walking, and things are coming before me, and we'll just see where the road leads. But I'm trying not to say no. And of course that would include that part of the industry that is so beloved to me. I love, live performance. I mean, in front of a live studio audience, both as a director and as an actor. But I just want to work, and I feel like I've got some energy left when all's said and done. And, we'll just see what happens. And again, I have no idea what's ahead, but I'm just curious to find out.
Well, look, I know that myself, all of us who are listening to this show, we are, anticipating the very best for you. We're excited to see where you land next, what you'll be doing next. But while that is going on, while we're waiting, luckily we've got 11 seasons, 10 years worth of Married with Children to catch up on and binge and watch you on all over again during that time.
I never quit acting. It's as if I never stopped. Oh, those 80s hairdos and wardrobe, that'll haunt me forever. Anyway.
Well, look, it's not a bad problem to be in a show that was so great, to have been such an amazing performer that we're still watching it all these years later. So I really personally so excited and appreciate the fact that you came on the show to talk about this show and this episode and everything that you did behind the camera and in front of the camera for it. So it's
been my pleasure.
Awesome.
And I just have to tell you that without fans like you, and we would not have had this longevity. We would not have made a stamp. We would not have probably made it 10 years, 11 seasons. And it just, for me personally, it never gets old hearing from people who have enjoyed the show and the work that we did, that we came together to do. And so it's been delightful speaking with you. Thanks again for all of your support and your enjoyment. And that's what we set out to do. And, it's a full circle experience with an audience. So you've just been the best, Jerry. Thank you.
You too. Thank you. And thank you guys for checking us out this week on The Laugh Track.